Welcome back. We're talking Tibet here on Inside Story. 50 years since the uprising there, which led to the Dalai Lama's exile. And after those 50 years, with no obvious progress towards autonomy, some are now questioning how effective this so-called middle way has been. Some Tibetans, especially those in exile, say even if Tibet does get autonomy, it may not be enough. They say a new nation may be the only way forward and point to newly created Kosovo and East Timor as examples. Then there's the younger generation, some of which advocate more hardline efforts, even in some cases an armed struggle and a demand for full independence. But having said all that, the majority of those living in Tibet still want autonomy through peaceful means. But perhaps their faith in the exiled Dalai Lama is waning, begging the question, what is the real way forward? Well, voices of Tibetans around the world on this anniversary vary, and while some are pushing for an internal revolt inside Tibet to bring China to the negotiating table, others are calling for the necessity to unite in order to achieve the goal of the Tibetan struggle.
We push and push that eventually we are able to make things difficult in Tibet for the Chinese government, that they will be the one seeking negotiations with the Tibetan government here. They will become the ones who are appealing to the Dalai Lama to talk to them, not the other way around.
The Tibetans in exile should be united. Otherwise, if you remain isolated from one another, then the force, the strength of the unity is lost. So then there is, how can we possibly achieve a goal of the Tibetan struggle?
They arrested us when we took to the streets. They sprayed me in the eyes with something. Now I have some problems to see in the bright light. They use these torture methods, though it's against the law.
Still with us, our guests in Zurich, Wang Po Tetong, in London, Andrew Leung, and in New Mexico, Ken Hammond. Gentlemen, thanks for staying with us. Back to Zurich now, and Wang Po Tetong. We've mentioned the younger generation a few times, and we heard some of their voices just then, so I just want to focus on them for a moment. They are sometimes viewed as more active, some people might say militant. Is there potential for this uprising, which some people talk about, particularly if we get to the point of succession to the Dalai Lama?
Yeah, I think basically there is a lot of frustration among the young people about the situation as it is now in Tibet. There's no progress for a political solution. The human rights situation is getting worse and worse. And for this reason, there are many young Tibetans who question, you see, the policy of the Dalai Lama and think something new has to come. On the other hand, we see, you see, the situation in China, and we see that there's no, you see, that there must be some change in the Chinese leadership to have a real change also in Tibet. So it's a very, very complicated situation. And I think the true reality is, for some years, we can't hope for a real solution of the Tibetan situation. So the only thing that is left to the Tibetans is to, you see, to go through these difficult times, to keep the unity and keep up the spirit of resistance. I think this is the only option that is left to the Tibetans.
Is that what it's all about, Ken Hammond, about keeping up resistance? Because you know, we see it in other parts of the world. We see it in Israel, Palestine, for example, what resistance does and what resistance doesn't do. In your opinion, is it the way forward?
Well, I think that in a bottom line sort of way, no, I don't think that that it is. I think that in the coming years and coming decades, the biggest set of changes that I think are likely to take place in Tibet, within Tibet, in China, are going to be changes of economic development, changes in the sort of modern nature of Tibetan society, particularly urban Tibetan society. And I think that for many young urban Tibetans, that's going to lead them down paths, down life choices that may lead them away from the traditional culture, may lead them away from traditional spirituality. And I think may lead to a greater distance between Tibetans in Tibet and the exile community, which holds on to its traditions understandably quite strongly. You know, a refugee community, an exile community has a greater vested interest in retaining those traditional patterns, whereas the pace of development, modernization, improvements in the material standards of living in Tibet those are, for better or for worse, eroding many of the traditional infrastructures of Tibetan life. And we may lament that, but it is a phenomenon we've seen in many other places around the world as well. And I think that to suggest that somehow a kind of intransigent resistance posture is going to ultimately wear down the negative position of the Chinese is naive. And I think that some way forward that recognizes that life in Tibet itself is changing is really the best hope that the Tibetan people have.
Let's flip it around then, and I'll put this to Andrew Leung in London. If you give people freedom, if you give people a chance, and as Ken Hammond was talking about, more infrastructure, better economic chances, better social chances, better social values, if you give them all that, that could even get rid of the desire for resistance. You give people freedom, they might resist less. Wouldn't that be a way forward for China?
Well, I mean, freedom is a relative thing. I mean, for example, you can say that the people outside Tibet and the rest of China, they're much freer than compared with before. But freedom in any society is not total, particularly when it impinges on the question of territorial integrity. And then you talk about culture, and I think my colleagues is right. I mean, the life in Tibet has changed so much. And if we look at, say, 50 years ago, what was Tibet? I mean, Tibet before the communists came, it was a serfdom. I mean, it was a theocracy, and the people in Tibet, they had no personal freedoms. If you look at the historical records, they were treated as chattels of the ruling theocracy. So when the Tibet was occupied by China, on the one hand, they stationed the troops there, but on the other hand, the old system was changed. Now, as far as culture is concerned, I mean,
sorry, could it not arguably flourish even more if it was given more, I know I'm using this word again, but more freedom or more autonomy or more independence? Could it arguably not flourish even more and become less of a problem for China?
Well, for example, if you look at Tibet, well, there is no doubt that perhaps a way forward is to embrace more local Tibetans, for example, into the administration. That may be a way forward. But on the other hand, I think the Chinese is standing very firm. And I'm not talking about just the government. If you ask any Chinese outside Tibet, I can bet that there are more than 90%, 95%, the entire Chinese people would not tolerate a situation of Tibet separating from China. So no matter you change the government policies or any kind of leaders, the situation about the heart of the Chinese people towards Tibet would not change. So I think the confrontation won't solve the issue. What is required is a more openness on both sides. Situation in Tibet has changed. I think there is a lot of improvements there that should be put on the table, especially for the outside world to understand. And of course, there are genuine grievances about the Tibetans feeling a bit of marginalized, especially on the economic front, because they are not as business savvy as the Han Chinese. And I think all these issues should be put on the table, and both sides should really come clean on them.
Let's turn it around again then, as we just start to wind the clock down here a bit. Wangpo Tetong in Zurich. We've talked a lot in this half about what China can be doing and how China can be helped. I'm interested just to get your thoughts on what Tibet itself could be doing, what Tibetans themselves could do to help themselves in this situation.
I think the Tibetans, you have to reach out to the Chinese intelligence community, no, to the academics in China, and this is done. And we have now the first responses from this community. There are many people inside China who have now better understanding of the Tibetan situation. And there are many dissidents and intellectuals who speak out on behalf of the Tibetans and say that it can't be only the economic situation, but the Tibetan have also to get, you see, some political rights, you see. And there are even people inside China who are calling for Tibetan freedom or independence, you see. So we see a progress, you see, in China itself in terms of, you see, how they see Tibet. And I'm quite hopeful, you see, that these voices will grow. And soon, you see, if we have an open society in China, that these voices, you see, also find some support in the Chinese people. That's what we are actually have to do, I think we have to convince the Chinese that we're not a threat for them, that we want to be equals, you see, and that we are not having any sort of, you see, aggressive ideas about China, on China, but that we want to live as neighbors with the Chinese peacefully. And I think this message, you see, we go, can, you see, be successful, yeah.
Thank you for those thoughts there. Wang Po Tetong in Zurich, also Andrew Leung in London, and Ken Hammond in New Mexico. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our viewer for joining us here for this edition of Inside Story. Your comments, your suggestions, send them to that address right there. It's Inside Story at aljazeera.net. From the whole team, goodbye for now.